The fluorescent lights of Murphy's diner cast their familiar sickly yellow glow across the cracked linoleum floor as Sarah Mitchell untied her grease-stained apron for the last time that October night. It was 11:47 p.m. on October 15th, 1994, and the 19-year-old had just finished another grueling double shift in Millfield, Minnesota, a town so small that everyone knew your name, your business, and usually your secrets. Sarah folded the apron with the same careful precision she applied to everything in her life, tucking it into her locker alongside her dream of saving enough money to attend nursing school the following fall. The diner was empty, except for Frank Murphy, the aging owner who had been running the place since the Kennedy administration. He watched Sarah gather her things with the protective eye of a surrogate father. She'd been working there since junior year of high school, and he'd grown accustomed to her quiet reliability and infectious smile that could soften even the grumpiest farmers during the morning coffee rush. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and that sharp bite of approaching winter that every Minnesotan recognized as nature's final warning. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass door, the familiar bell announcing her departure with its dull brass chime. The parking lot stretched before her like a small ocean of gravel and shadow, illuminated only by a single streetlight that had been flickering intermittently for weeks. Her blue 1989 Honda Civic sat exactly where she'd left it 12 hours earlier, just 50 feet from the diner's entrance, close enough that she'd never felt unsafe during her countless late-night walks to the car. The crisp air filled her lungs as she dug through her worn leather purse, searching for keys that had been jangling in the same pocket all day. Her breath formed small clouds in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked with the restless energy of a creature sensing something amiss in the night. Sarah's fingers closed around the familiar weight of her key ring, a small plastic charm from the state fair still attached from the previous summer. What happened in those next moments would haunt Millfield for the next 30 years. Frank Murphy, counting the day's modest receipts at the register, heard what he would later describe to investigators as a brief scuffle, the sound of gravel being kicked, a muffled noise that could have been a dropped purse or something far more sinister. When he looked up from his counting, perhaps 30 seconds later, the parking lot appeared unchanged. Sarah's car remained in its spot, but the silence had taken on a different quality, heavier, more oppressive. By midnight, when Sarah's mother Linda began calling the diner looking for her daughter, who should have been home 20 minutes earlier, Frank Murphy made a discovery that would chill him to his core. Sarah's keys lay scattered across the gravel like silver tears, catching the stuttering light of the broken street lamp. Her purse sat undisturbed on the ground nearby, wallet intact, the $17 in tips from her shift still folded neatly in the side pocket. Her car keys, house keys, and that cheerful state fair charm formed a trail leading from where her car was parked toward the edge of the lot, where the asphalt gave way to the county road that stretched into darkness. Sarah Mitchell had simply vanished, as completely as if the October night had swallowed her whole. In a town where people forgot to lock their doors and children played unsupervised until streetlights came on, the impossible had happened. Someone was gone, and no one had seen anything at all. Sheriff Robert Hansen received the call at 12:43 a.m., jarring him from the first deep sleep he'd managed in weeks. At 52, Hansen had been protecting Millfield for nearly 2 decades, dealing primarily with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional theft of farm equipment. Missing persons cases were virtually unheard of in a community where everyone's daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. He pulled on his uniform in the darkness of his bedroom, his wife Margaret stirring just enough to murmur a sleepy question he couldn't quite answer. The scene at Murphy's diner struck Hansen with an immediate sense of wrongness that he couldn't articulate. Under the harsh beam of his flashlight, Sarah's scattered keys looked almost deliberate, too perfectly spread to be accidental. Her purse, sitting upright and undisturbed, seemed to mock every missing person's protocol he'd ever learned. There were no signs of a struggle, no skid marks, no broken glass or torn fabric, just the absence of a young woman who should have been safely home in her childhood bedroom, planning her escape from small-town life. Hansen's department consisted of himself, 2 full-time deputies, and a part-time dispatcher who also worked at the post office. The nearest state police barracks was 45 minutes away, and Hansen knew that in those crucial first hours, the responsibility for finding Sarah Mitchell rested squarely on his shoulders. He called Deputy James Walsh first, then Deputy Patricia Clark, rousing them from sleep to begin what would become the largest search operation in Millfield's history. By dawn, word had spread through the town's invisible network of phone trees and coffee shop conversations. Nearly 200 volunteers gathered in the diner's parking lot as the October sun struggled through low-hanging clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Hansen watched farmers abandon their morning chores, shop owners close their stores, and elderly women arrive with thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches. Sarah wasn't just a missing person. She was everyone's daughter, sister, neighbor. The search parties spread out like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Groups of 10 moved methodically through cornfields where the stalks stood brown and brittle, ready for harvest. Others combed the dense woods that bordered the county road, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse and desperate. Hansen coordinated from his patrol car, radio crackling with reports that all carried the same devastating message. Nothing found, no trace, no sign. The bloodhounds arrived from the state police barracks at noon, 2 German shepherds named Rex and Lady who had successfully located missing persons in 3 previous cases. Hansen watched with growing hope as the dogs picked up Sarah's scent from her abandoned purse, their noses working the ground with focused intensity. For 47 minutes, the dogs followed a trail that led from the parking lot toward the county road, their handlers growing increasingly confident that they were close to a breakthrough. Then, at the intersection where County Road 12 met Highway 71, the dogs simply stopped. Rex circled 3 times, whimpered, and sat down. Lady pawed at the asphalt, her tail dropping as if she'd encountered something that confused every instinct. The handlers tried for another hour, encouraging the dogs to pick up the trail again, but it was as if Sarah Mitchell had simply evaporated into the Minnesota air. As the October sky darkened and the first cold drops of rain began to fall, Hansen made the call that would haunt him for decades. The active search was suspended, pending further evidence or leads. Volunteers trudged back to their cars, mud-caked and exhausted, avoiding eye contact with Linda Mitchell, who stood at the edge of the parking lot, clutching one of Sarah's work shirts, her face a mask of disbelief and growing horror. The case was transferred to the state investigators within a week, but with no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no leads. It quickly joined the growing file of cold cases that gathered dust in manila folders. Winter arrived early that year, covering Millfield in snow that seemed to bury not just the landscape, but any hope of finding answers to Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. Linda Mitchell transformed her kitchen table into a shrine of obsession within 3 months of Sarah's disappearance. What began as a simple manila folder containing police reports and newspaper clippings gradually consumed the entire surface, spreading like a cancer of grief across the worn Formica, where her family had shared thousands of meals. By Christmas of 1994, guests could no longer sit down for holiday dinner. Every inch was covered with photographs, witness statements, maps marked with red ink, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies across 3 states. The centerpiece of Linda's makeshift command center was an 8x10 school photograph of Sarah, her daughter's genuine smile frozen in time beneath the harsh flash of the camera. Around it, Linda had arranged the case files in what she called her circles of possibility. Closest to Sarah's photo were the confirmed facts, then the probable leads, then the long shots that kept her awake at night, wondering if she'd missed something crucial. She'd labeled everything with her careful handwriting, the same script she'd used to sign permission slips and birthday cards for 19 years. Every morning, Linda brewed her coffee and settled into the wooden chair that had become her permanent post, reviewing each piece of evidence as if it were scripture she needed to memorize. She'd trained herself to think like an investigator, learning the language of police reports and forensic procedures through pure determination. When Sheriff Hanson retired in 1998, Linda was there to brief his replacement. When the case was transferred to state investigators in 2001, she arrived at their offices with a 3-inch binder containing every detail she'd compiled, organized by date and cross-referenced by potential significance. The kitchen table became a pilgrimage site for other families dealing with missing loved ones. Linda's reputation spread through support groups and online forums, and desperate parents would drive hours to sit at her table and learn how to navigate the bureaucracy of cold case investigations. She became fluent in the frustrating vocabulary of jurisdictional limitations, evidence preservation requirements, and the painful distinction between active and suspended investigations. Linda's husband, David, watched his wife's transformation with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. The woman he'd married had been spontaneous and carefree, someone who baked cookies on impulse and danced in the living room to radio songs. The woman who now lived in their house spoke in measured sentences about chain of custody and DNA degradation, her eyes carrying a haunted quality that never quite faded, even during rare moments of laughter. Their marriage survived, but it changed, shaped around the empty space where their daughter should have been. For 30 years, Linda maintained a correspondence network that resembled a small intelligence operation. She exchanged letters with retired detectives who remembered Sarah's case, followed up with witnesses whose memories might have sharpened over time, and tracked down every person who had lived in Millfield during October 1994. Her phone bill reflected calls to police departments in 12 states, following leads that usually ended in disappointment, but occasionally opened new avenues of investigation. The most devastating moments came not from dead ends, but from false hope. In 2003, a woman matching Sarah's description was found living under an assumed name in Oregon, suffering from amnesia after a car accident. Linda flew there at her own expense, holding her breath during the 3-hour flight, only to discover that the woman was a stranger who happened to share Sarah's height and hair color. In 2011, construction workers in neighboring county found skeletal remains that sent Linda racing to the coroner's office, her heart pounding with equal measures of dread and desperate hope, only to learn that the bones belonged to a Native American woman who had died decades earlier. Through it all, the kitchen table remained her anchor to sanity and purpose. Neighbors grew accustomed to seeing Linda's silhouette through the window at all hours, bent over photographs and documents, like a monk studying illuminated manuscripts. She refused to give up the table, even when David suggested they might need the space for their grandchildren to visit. The table had become sacred ground, and Linda Mitchell was its faithful guardian, keeping vigil over her daughter's memory with the unshakable conviction that persistence would eventually unlock the truth that someone, somewhere, was determined to keep buried. Detective Amy Rodriguez discovered the box on a Tuesday morning in March 2019 while overseeing the department's move to their new facility across town. The Millfield Sheriff's Department had finally outgrown the cramped building they'd occupied since 1967, and the process of transferring decades of files, evidence, and equipment had revealed forgotten corners and overlooked storage areas that hadn't been properly catalogued in years. Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who had transferred from Minneapolis specifically to escape the chaos of big city crime, found herself oddly drawn to the cold cases that rural Minnesota seemed to preserve, like insects in amber. The box was wedged behind a broken filing cabinet in the basement evidence room, covered with a layer of dust so thick it looked like felt. Someone had written 1994 MISC in faded blue ink across the cardboard, a label so vague it could have contained anything from drunk driving evidence to property theft reports. Rodriguez almost assigned it to the disposal pile. Departments were required to maintain evidence for specific time periods, and much of the 1994 material had already exceeded legal requirements for preservation. Something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the way the box seemed heavier than its size suggested, or maybe the fact that 1994 had been mentioned in several of the cold case files she'd been reviewing during quiet afternoon shifts. Rodriguez carried the box upstairs to her desk and carefully peeled away the packing tape that had yellowed and cracked over 25 years of storage. The smell hit her first, a musty odor mixed with something chemical, like old evidence bags and preservation fluid. Inside, she found a collection of items that had clearly been gathered hastily and stored without proper cataloguing. There were plastic bags containing soil samples from various locations around Millfield, photographs of tire tracks that had long since been paved over, and witness statements that had been typed on an actual typewriter, complete with correction fluid and uneven spacing. At the bottom of the box, Rodriguez found two items that made her pulse quicken. The first was a torn piece of blue fabric sealed in a plastic evidence bag, labeled simply, "Found at Scene, Jacket Material." The fabric looked like denim, but there was something else attached to it. Fibers that were clearly from a different source, darker and coarser than the blue material. The second item was a cigarette butt in another evidence bag, marked County Road 12 intersection, possible connection. Someone had written a date in pencil, October 16th, 1994. Rodriguez felt the familiar tingle of recognition that every experienced detective knew, the sense that she was looking at something significant, even if she couldn't yet understand why. She pulled Sarah Mitchell's case file from the cold case archive and spread it across her desk, comparing the items she'd found with the evidence inventory that had been compiled during the original investigation. Neither the fabric nor the cigarette butt appeared on any official list. The realization struck her like a physical blow. These weren't processed evidence that had been properly catalogued and forgotten. These were items that had been collected during the initial investigation but never submitted for forensic analysis. For 25 years, they had sat in a basement while Sarah Mitchell's family lived with unanswered questions and the terrible uncertainty that comes with unsolved cases. Rodriguez immediately called the State Crime Lab, her hands trembling slightly as she explained the situation. DNA analysis had advanced exponentially since 1994, and techniques that had been impossible during the original investigation were now routine. The cigarette butt in particular could yield a complete genetic profile if it had been properly preserved, which the evidence bag suggested it had been. While waiting for the lab appointment, Rodriguez dove deeper into the original case files, looking for any mention of the fabric or cigarette. She found a brief note in Sheriff Hanson's handwriting, dated October 17, 1994. Collected additional items from scene will process when lab availability improves. A second note, dated November 3, 1994, simply read, Winter budget constraints. Postpone non-essential lab work until spring. Spring had never come for Sarah Mitchell's evidence. Budget cuts, personnel changes, and the simple passage of time had buried these crucial pieces of the puzzle beneath layers of bureaucratic oversight and administrative neglect. Rodriguez stared at the evidence bags, wondering how many other cases had been lost, not to criminal cunning, but to the mundane failures of overworked police departments and insufficient resources. As she prepared to drive the evidence to the state lab, Rodriguez felt the weight of 25 years of missed opportunities. Somewhere in those fibers or in the DNA that might still cling to that cigarette butt was the key to answering Linda Mitchell's decades of questions. The truth had been waiting patiently in a cardboard box, and Rodriguez was finally ready to set it free. The call from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension came on a Thursday afternoon in June 2019, 8 weeks after Detective Rodriguez had delivered the forgotten evidence to their laboratory in St. Paul. Dr. Maria Santos, the forensic DNA analyst assigned to the case, spoke with the measured precision of someone accustomed to delivering news that could shatter or rebuild lives. The cigarette butt had yielded a complete male DNA profile, 13 markers that painted a genetic fingerprint as unique as a snowflake, preserved in saliva that had dried and crystallized over 25 years of storage. Rodriguez felt her heart accelerate as Dr. Santos explained the technical details. The DNA was remarkably well preserved, protected by the evidence bag and the dry basement conditions that had inadvertently created an ideal storage environment. More importantly, the profile was complete enough to run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that connected crime labs across the United States, searching for matches among convicted offenders, arrestees, and evidence from other unsolved cases. The initial CODIS search yielded nothing, no matches in the database of known offenders, no connections to other crimes. For a brief, devastating moment, Rodriguez feared they had reached another dead end, that this breakthrough would join the long list of leads that had promised everything and delivered heartbreak. But Dr. Santos had more to offer than traditional forensic databases. The revolution in genetic genealogy had opened new possibilities that hadn't existed even 5 years earlier. Techniques that could trace family connections through public ancestry databases and identify suspects through their relatives' recreational DNA testing. Rodriguez authorized the genealogical investigation with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She understood that they were entering uncharted territory, using methods that had successfully solved decades-old cases across the country, but had never been applied to a Millfield investigation. The process would take months, perhaps longer, as genealogists constructed family trees and traced lineages through generations of birth records, marriage certificates, and census data. Linda Mitchell received the news on a humid evening in July, sitting at her kitchen table command center, as Rodriguez explained the potential breakthrough. For the first time in 25 years, Linda allowed herself to imagine that her daughter's case might actually be solved. She had watched other families celebrate closure through genealogical investigations: the Golden State Killer, the Bear Brook murders, countless Jane and John Does finally given their names back. The technology felt like science fiction to someone who had spent decades relying on paper files and telephone calls. But Linda embraced it with the desperate hope of a woman who had exhausted every other possibility. The genealogical investigation consumed the summer and fall of 2019. Rodriguez received periodic updates from the genetic genealogy team, reports that read like detective novels as researchers traced DNA connections through branches of family trees that stretched back to the 1800s. They identified potential surnames, narrowed geographic regions, and slowly constructed a web of relationships that might eventually lead to the man who had left his saliva on a cigarette butt near the spot where Sarah Mitchell vanished. The breakthrough came in January 2020, delivered in a phone call that would change everything. The genealogical team had identified a cluster of close DNA matches that pointed to a specific family line originating in rural Wisconsin. From there, they had constructed a detailed family tree that included living descendants, cross-referencing public records, obituaries, and social media profiles to identify men of the right age who would have been in Minnesota during October 1994. One name emerged from the research with startling clarity: Thomas Edward Brennan, born March 15, 1957, in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. A construction worker who had lived in Millfield from 1992 to 1996 before relocating to Florida. A man whose DNA profile would be an exact match for the evidence found near the intersection of County Road 12 and Highway 71, where the bloodhounds had lost Sarah Mitchell's trail 26 years earlier. Rodriguez stared at the photograph that accompanied the genealogical report, a driver's license photo showing a middle-aged man with graying hair and unremarkable features, someone who could blend into any crowd, any community, any search party looking for a missing girl. The initial background check on Thomas Edward Brennan revealed a life of calculated normalcy that sent chills down Detective Rodriguez's spine. Born to a working-class family in Wisconsin, Brennan had moved to Millfield in January 1992, renting a small house on Elm Street, exactly 2 blocks from Murphy's Diner. He had worked construction for Patterson Brothers Building Company, a local firm that handled residential and small commercial projects throughout the county. His employment record showed steady work, no disciplinary actions, and the kind of reliable attendance that made him valuable to employers who needed dependable crews for long-term projects. What disturbed Rodriguez most was how thoroughly Brennan had integrated himself into the community fabric. Church records from St. Mary's Catholic Church showed that he had been a regular attendee at Sunday morning services, sitting in the same pew each week and participating in the annual parish fundraising drives. The Millfield Volunteer Fire Department had accepted him as an auxiliary member in 1993, and he had responded to calls for barn fires, car accidents, and medical emergencies with the dedication of a man who genuinely cared about his neighbors' welfare. The search party records from October 1994 contained Brennan's name on 3 separate volunteer lists. He had joined the organized searches on October 16th, 17th, and 18th, spending hours combing through the same woods and fields where law enforcement officers were desperately looking for any trace of Sarah Mitchell. Witnesses remembered him as helpful and concerned, someone who had asked thoughtful questions about search patterns and had volunteered to cover the more difficult terrain that other volunteers avoided. Rodriguez studied the crime scene photographs with new eyes, knowing that Thomas Brennan had been among the people walking through the area where Sarah's keys had been scattered. The thought that Sarah's killer had joined the search for her filled Rodriguez with a cold rage that she struggled to contain. How many times had Brennan stood next to Linda Mitchell during those awful October days, offering comfort and support, while knowing exactly what had happened to her daughter? The Florida Department of Motor Vehicles confirmed that Brennan currently resided in a modest ranch house in Clearwater, where he had lived since 1997. Property records showed he had purchased the home with cash, a detail that raised immediate questions about the source of his financing. His Florida employment history revealed a pattern similar to his Minnesota years: steady construction work, no criminal record, community involvement that included coaching Little League Baseball and volunteering at a local food bank. Rodriguez initiated surveillance through the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, requesting discreet observation of Brennan's daily routines while she built the case for an arrest warrant. The reports painted a picture of a man living quietly in retirement, tending a small garden behind his house and making weekly trips to the same grocery store and pharmacy. Neighbors described him as friendly but private, someone who waved from his front porch but rarely engaged in extended conversations. The most disturbing discovery came from Brennan's Minnesota driving records. During his 4 years in Millfield, he had received citations for speeding on County Road 12, the same stretch of highway where the bloodhounds had lost Sarah's scent, on 3 separate occasions. The citations were spaced months apart, suggesting a pattern of regular travel along that route rather than random violations. One citation had been issued just 6 days before Sarah's disappearance, raising the possibility that Brennan had been familiar with that particular area and had perhaps even used it before for purposes that Rodriguez preferred not to imagine. Church records from Clearwater revealed that Brennan had never mentioned his time in Minnesota to fellow parishioners, allowing them to believe he was a lifelong Florida resident. When questioned by surveillance officers posing as door-to-door salesmen, neighbors reported that Brennan had told them he was originally from Wisconsin, but had moved directly to Florida after military service that records showed had never occurred. As Rodriguez compiled the evidence for presentation to the county attorney, she found herself imagining the moment when Brennan would realize that his 26 years of freedom were ending. He had built a life predicated on the assumption that Sarah Mitchell's case would remain forever unsolved, that the evidence linking him to her disappearance would never be found or analyzed. The cigarette butt that had preserved his DNA was probably discarded without a second thought, the casual littering of a man who believed he had committed the perfect crime. The warrant for Thomas Edward Brennan's arrest was signed on February 14th, 2020, Valentine's Day, a date that Rodriguez would later remember as bitterly appropriate for a case that had broken so many hearts. 26 years after Sarah Mitchell vanished from a diner parking lot, her killer was finally going to face justice. The arrest of Thomas Edward Brennan on February 18, 2020, in the driveway of his Clearwater home, marked the beginning of an investigation that would methodically dismantle 26 years of carefully constructed lies. Detective Rodriguez had flown to Florida with 2 other investigators, arriving at Brennan's modest ranch house at 6:47 a.m. as he prepared to leave for his morning walk. The man who answered the door looked older than his 63 years, his face weathered by decades of Florida sun, but his eyes carried the sharp alertness of someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. Brennan's initial reaction to the arrest was one of confused cooperation rather than surprise. He asked no questions about the charges, made no demands to understand why Minnesota police officers were reading him his rights in a Florida driveway. His neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, watching their quiet, helpful neighbor being loaded into an unmarked sedan with the bewildered expressions of people witnessing something that violated their understanding of their safe, suburban world. Back in Minnesota, Rodriguez began the painstaking process of reconstructing Brennan's life during his 4 years in Millfield. What emerged was a timeline that revealed not the random act of violence that investigators had initially suspected, but a pattern of escalating behavior that suggested Sarah Mitchell's murder was the culmination of months, possibly years, of predatory planning. Employment records from Patterson Brothers Building Company showed that Brennan had worked on 17 different projects during his time in Millfield, many of them residential jobs that would have given him intimate knowledge of local families, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. Of particular interest was a job he had completed in September 1994, just 1 month before Sarah's disappearance, installing new windows at the Mitchell family home. The work order, signed by Sarah's father David, confirmed that Brennan had spent 3 days at the house, during which time he would have observed the family's daily patterns and learned about Sarah's job at Murphy's Diner. Rodriguez interviewed David Mitchell, now 71, and bearing the weight of decades spent wondering if he could have somehow prevented his daughter's death. His memory of the window installation was surprisingly clear, perhaps sharpened by the terrible irony of having unknowingly welcomed his daughter's future killer into their home. David remembered Brennan as polite and professional, someone who had complimented Sarah's college plans and had asked thoughtful questions about her work schedule. What had seemed like friendly conversation at the time now revealed itself as reconnaissance conducted with chilling calculation. The timeline reconstruction revealed other disturbing patterns. Brennan had been issued those speeding citations on County Road 12 during late evening hours, suggesting he had made multiple trips along the route where Sarah would later vanish. Gas station receipts, painstakingly tracked through old credit card records, showed that Brennan had purchased cigarettes, the same brand found at the crime scene, at Murphy's Gas and Go, located directly across the street from Murphy's Diner, on at least 6 occasions during the months preceding Sarah's disappearance. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery that Brennan had attended Sarah's high school graduation ceremony in June 1994, 4 months before her murder. The ceremony had been open to the public, held in the school gymnasium with parents, relatives, and community members filling the bleachers to celebrate the small graduating class. Several witnesses remembered seeing Brennan there, though none had questioned his presence at the time. In a town like Millfield, community events drew people from throughout the area, and his attendance had seemed perfectly normal. Rodriguez found herself reconstructing not just a timeline, but a hunting pattern. Brennan had systematically inserted himself into Sarah's world, learning her habits and vulnerabilities with the patience of a predator who understood that successful stalking required time and careful observation. The window installation job had provided him with crucial intelligence about the Mitchell family's routines, while his regular purchases at the gas station across from Murphy's diner had allowed him to observe Sarah's work schedule and identify the perfect opportunity for an attack. The investigation revealed that on the night of October 15, 1994, Brennan had not been at his mother's bedside as he had claimed to investigators. Hospital records from Wisconsin showed that his mother had been admitted to a different facility entirely, nearly 200 miles from where Brennan claimed to have been visiting her. His alibi, which had seemed solid enough to eliminate him as a suspect in 1994, crumbled under scrutiny that advanced record-keeping and cross-jurisdictional cooperation had finally made possible. The interrogation room at the Millfield Police Department had been renovated since 1994, but Detective Rodriguez had chosen it deliberately for its symbolic significance. This was where the original investigation had stalled, where witnesses had been interviewed and released, where theories had been constructed and abandoned as the case grew cold. Now, 26 years later, Thomas Brennan sat across from Rodriguez at the same scarred metal table, where Sheriff Hansen had once spread crime scene photographs and pleaded with potential witnesses to remember something, anything, that might bring Sarah Mitchell home. Brennan's extradition from Florida had taken 3 weeks, during which time Rodriguez had prepared for this moment with the meticulous care of someone who understood that she would likely have only one opportunity to extract the truth. She had studied every interrogation manual, consulted with FBI behavioral analysts, and reviewed recordings of successful confessions in similar cold cases. The weight of Linda Mitchell's 26 years of waiting pressed down on every question she planned to ask. The man who sat across from her bore little resemblance to the helpful community member who had joined Sarah's search parties. Prison transport and the stress of arrest had aged Brennan dramatically, revealing the hollow cheeks and sunken eyes of someone whose carefully constructed life had collapsed in a matter of hours. His hands trembled slightly as he signed the Miranda waiver, and Rodriguez noticed that he avoided making direct eye contact, instead focusing on a water stain on the ceiling tiles that had been there since the building's construction. Rodriguez began with gentle questions about Brennan's time in Millfield, allowing him to establish a pattern of cooperation before gradually steering the conversation toward more dangerous territory. She had learned that successful interrogations were like surgical procedures. Each incision had to be precise, each revelation building toward the inevitable moment when the suspect's psychological defenses would finally collapse under the weight of accumulated evidence. For 2 hours, Brennan maintained his innocence with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades perfecting his story. He claimed to remember Sarah only vaguely, describing her as a nice girl who worked at the diner and expressing appropriate sympathy for her family's loss. When Rodriguez presented the DNA evidence, Brennan suggested that contamination or laboratory error might explain the match, displaying a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of forensic science for someone claiming complete ignorance of the case details. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez described the window installation job at the Mitchell house. Something in Brennan's expression shifted, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes that suggested she had touched a nerve he hadn't expected to be exposed. She pressed the advantage, describing how David Mitchell remembered their conversations about Sarah's college plans and work schedule. watching as Brennan's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Rodriguez laid out the timeline piece by piece, each revelation building pressure like water behind a failing dam. The speeding citations on County Road 12, the cigarette purchases across from Murphy's diner, his presence at Sarah's graduation ceremony, the false alibi that placed him at his mother's bedside in the wrong city, the wrong hospital, on the wrong night entirely. She watched Brennan's breathing become shallow and rapid, his hands clasping and unclasping as if he were physically trying to hold onto a story that was disintegrating before his eyes. The confession came in fragments, delivered in a voice so quiet that Rodriguez had to lean forward to hear the words that would finally answer Linda Mitchell's decades of questions. Brennan described watching Sarah leave the diner that night, following her to the parking lot with no clear plan beyond talking to her about something he claimed he could no longer remember. He spoke of a conversation that had escalated, of Sarah becoming frightened and threatening to call for help, of a moment of panic when he realized that everything he had built in Millfield was about to be destroyed. As Brennan continued speaking, his voice growing stronger as if confession was providing a relief he hadn't expected, Rodriguez understood that she was listening to something far more calculated than a moment of panic. This was the methodical recounting of a crime that had been planned and executed with chilling precision, disguised for 26 years as a random act of violence by a man who had proven himself capable of living with the secret that had destroyed so many other lives. The recording equipment captured every word, preserving the confession that would finally allow Linda Mitchell to replace decades of terrible uncertainty with the even more terrible certainty of knowing exactly what had happened to her daughter on that October night when the world had changed forever. The location Thomas Brennan described during his confession was both specific and heartbreakingly vague. A stand of white pine trees approximately 15 miles northeast of Millfield, near an abandoned logging road that had been used by hunters and teenagers seeking privacy since the 1970s. As part of his plea agreement, Brennan had agreed to lead investigators to Sarah Mitchell's remains, a prospect that filled Detective Rodriguez with equal measures of anticipation and dread. After 26 years of questions, the Mitchell family would finally have answers, but those answers would come in the form of bones and forensic evidence rather than the living daughter they had never stopped hoping might somehow walk through their front door. The search party that assembled on the grey morning of April 3, 2020, was smaller and more sombre than the massive volunteer effort that had combed Millfield's fields and forests in October 1994. This time, the group consisted of trained professionals, forensic anthropologists from the State University, crime scene technicians with ground-penetrating radar equipment, and cadaver dogs whose specialized training had been honed on cases exactly like this one. Linda Mitchell had asked to be present, but Rodriguez had gently persuaded her to wait at home, understanding that some memories were too devastating to carry for whatever years remained to her. Brennan rode in the back of Rodriguez's patrol car, his hands cuffed and his directions delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he had used during his confession. He seemed almost relieved to be making this final journey, as if guiding investigators to Sarah's grave would somehow complete a process that had been weighing on his conscience for decades. Rodriguez found his apparent calm more disturbing than if he had been emotional or resistant. This was the behavior of a man who had made peace with his actions long ago and was simply completing necessary administrative details. The logging road was barely visible, overgrown with brush and small saplings that had reclaimed the tire ruts where logging trucks had once hauled timber to processing facilities that had closed before Sarah was born. Brennan directed them approximately 3/4 of a mile down the deteriorating path to a clearing surrounded by mature white pines whose branches filtered the spring sunlight into patterns of light and shadow that danced across the forest floor. It was achingly beautiful. the kind of place that should have hosted family picnics or romantic proposals rather than serving as a clandestine grave for a 19-year-old girl whose only crime had been working late at a small-town diner. Brennan pointed to a depression beneath the largest pine tree, an area where the ground seemed slightly lower than the surrounding terrain, and where the vegetation grew with a different density and color than the rest of the clearing. Rodriguez watched the forensic team begin their careful excavation, using brushes and small tools to remove decades of accumulated pine needles and soil with the reverence typically reserved for archaeological sites. The process was painstakingly slow, each layer of earth photographed and catalogued before being removed, each fragment of evidence treated as a sacred relic that might contain crucial information about Sarah's final moments. The first bone was discovered at a depth of 38 inches, a fragment of what the forensic anthropologist identified as a human femur. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had supervised the recovery of remains in dozens of similar cases, worked with practiced efficiency while maintaining the dignity that Sarah Mitchell deserved after 26 years of lying forgotten in this isolated grave. As more bones were carefully unearthed and placed in labeled containers, Rodriguez felt the weight of finally being able to provide Linda Mitchell with the closure she had sought for more than half her lifetime. The recovery process took 14 hours, interrupted by a brief thunderstorm that turned the forest floor into mud and complicated the careful excavation work. By evening, the forensic team had collected what appeared to be a complete skeleton, along with fragments of clothing and personal items that would need laboratory analysis for positive identification. Among the recovered evidence was a small gold ring that Rodriguez recognized from Sarah's missing person report, a high school class ring that her parents had given her for graduation, inscribed with her initials and the year 1994. As the evidence bags were loaded into the coroner's van for transport to the State Forensics Laboratory, Rodriguez stood alone in the clearing where Sarah Mitchell had spent 26 years waiting to be found. The white pines whispered in the evening breeze, and Rodriguez found herself thinking about the hundreds of people who had searched for Sarah in the wrong places, never imagining that she was resting in this remote grove where wildflowers now grew in soil enriched by her remains. The news of Thomas Brennan's arrest and confession spread through Millfield like wildfire, carried by the same informal networks that had once mobilized search parties and sustained hope during the darkest years of uncertainty. By the time the evening news trucks arrived from Minneapolis and Duluth, the town's main street was lined with residents who had gathered not to celebrate, but to grapple with the devastating revelation that Sarah Mitchell's killer had been hiding among them for 4 years, participating in their community events and earning their trust while carrying the secret of what he had done. Linda Mitchell received the official notification from Detective Rodriguez in her kitchen, sitting at the table that had served as her command center for 3 decades. The confirmation of Sarah's death hit her with unexpected force. Despite 26 years of assuming the worst, she realized that some part of her had never stopped hoping for a different outcome. David Mitchell held his wife as she wept with a grief that was somehow both fresh and ancient, the tears of a mother who had finally learned the truth she had spent half her life seeking. The formal identification of Sarah's remains took 6 weeks. But the presence of the class ring and dental records made the confirmation a formality rather than a genuine question. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's forensic analysis revealed details that Rodriguez chose not to share with the family, evidence of trauma that confirmed Brennan's confession while adding layers of horror that served no purpose beyond satisfying legal requirements. Sarah Mitchell had died on the night she disappeared, and she had been buried in that remote clearing within hours of her murder. Brennan's trial was scheduled for September 2020, but the COVID-19 pandemic that swept across the country during the spring created delays and complications that extended the legal process into 2021. He remained in the county jail, held without bail, while his court-appointed attorney struggled to construct a defense against DNA evidence, a detailed confession, and forensic proof that his client had lied about his whereabouts on the night of Sarah's murder. The defense strategy eventually settled on mental health claims and arguments for diminished capacity, but the methodical nature of Brennan's planning and his 26 years of successful deception undermined any suggestion that he was not fully responsible for his actions. The town of Millfield struggled to process the revelation that they had unknowingly harbored a killer for years. St. Mary's Catholic Church held special prayer services for the Mitchell family, while church members grappled with the knowledge that Thomas Brennan had sat in their pews every Sunday morning, contributing to collection plates with money earned through honest work, while carrying the weight of Sarah's murder in his conscience. The volunteer fire department quietly removed Brennan's name from their memorial plaque honoring auxiliary members, though they could not erase the memory of his helpfulness during genuine emergencies when people's lives had depended on his assistance. Frank Murphy, now 83 and suffering from the early stages of dementia, sometimes forgot that Sarah's case had been solved, asking his daughter during her visits whether anyone had found that sweet girl who used to work for me. His daughter chose not to remind him of the arrest and confession, allowing him to maintain whatever peace he had found in his fading memories of the diner and the employees he had loved like his own children. Detective Rodriguez found herself changed by the case in ways she hadn't anticipated. The successful resolution brought professional satisfaction and recognition from colleagues across the state, but it also left her with a deeper understanding of how evil could disguise itself behind neighborly smiles and community service. She began reviewing other cold cases with new perspectives, wondering how many other unsolved crimes might have been committed by people who had hidden their true nature behind carefully constructed personas of helpfulness and civic engagement. As Brennan awaited trial, Rodriguez often thought about the search parties that had combed Millfield's fields and forests in October 1994, and how the very man they were seeking had walked among them, helping to look for evidence he knew they would never find. The case had been solved through technological advances that couldn't have been imagined when Sarah first disappeared, but it had also been solved through the persistence of people who refused to let her be forgotten. In the end, that persistence had proved stronger than Brennan's carefully maintained secrets, and Sarah Mitchell had finally received the justice that had been delayed but never denied. The story of Sarah's case continues to resonate beyond Millfield's borders, reminding investigators and families that cold cases are never truly closed until they're solved, and that advances in forensic science can breathe new life into investigations that once seemed hopeless. If you've followed Sarah's story to this point, consider subscribing to hear about other cases where time and technology have finally delivered answers to families who never stopped believing that truth would eventually surface, no matter how deeply someone tried to bury it.